The blood was not hers, but the scars on her back told a different story, one written in raised flesh and faded white lines that mapped out a history of cruelty she had never deserved. Sara Northwood stood at the edge of the creek just beyond Fort McDowell, Arizona, in the summer heat of 1876, her worn calico dress hanging loose on her thin frame as she knelt to splash cool water on her face. She had been free for 3 months now, ever since the marshal had raided the Clayton ranch and discovered what Henry Clayton had been doing to his workers. But freedom felt like a word without meaning when she still woke up screaming most nights. The sun beat down mercilessly on the desert landscape, turning the Arizona territory into a furnace that made breathing feel like inhaling fire. Sara cupped another handful of water and pressed it to the back of her neck, careful not to let her fingers stray too far down her spine where the worst of the scars lay hidden beneath fabric. She had learned to dress herself without looking, to wash without seeing, to pretend that her body ended at her shoulders and began again at her waist. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, every muscle in her body going rigid with the old fear that never quite left her. She turned slowly, water dripping from her fingertips, and saw a rider approaching along the dusty trail. The horse was a beautiful bay gelding, well cared for and moving with the easy grace of an animal that trusted its rider. The man in the saddle sat tall but relaxed, his hat pulled low against the sun, and as he drew closer, Sara could see the kind of face that belonged in this harsh land. Weathered and strong, with eyes that crinkled at the corners from squinting into too many sunsets, he pulled up his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, miss. Didn't mean to startle you. Name's Knox Calloway. I'm looking for work at the Miller Ranch, but I seem to have gotten myself turned around in all this heat." Sara stood up slowly, wiping her wet hands on her skirt. Knox Calloway had a voice like smooth whiskey, warm and deep, and his eyes were the color of sage in spring. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled at his collar and a frame built from hard work rather than vanity. There was something gentle in the way he sat his horse, waiting for her response without pushing or demanding, that made her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. "The Miller Ranch is about 2 miles west," she said quietly, pointing with one hand. "Follow the creek until you see the old cottonwoods split by lightning, then head north. You'll see their fence line." Knox nodded his thanks, but did not immediately move to leave. "You all right out here by yourself? This sun is no joke, and I haven't seen another soul for miles." "I'm fine," Sara said, though the words came out more defensive than she intended. "I can take care of myself." Something flickered across Knox's face. Understanding maybe, or recognition of someone who had been hurt and was still building walls to keep the world at bay. He nodded again, slower this time. "I'm sure you can, miss. But if you ever need anything, once I get settled at the Miller place, you just ask for Knox. I may be new to Fort McDowell, but I'm good for my word." He rode off before she could respond, leaving her standing by the creek with her heart beating too fast and her hands trembling slightly. She told herself it was the heat, the surprise of being interrupted, anything but the way his eyes had looked at her like she was a person worth seeing. Sara made her way back to town as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Fort McDowell was a small settlement, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents clustered around the old army fort that gave the town its name. She worked at the boarding house run by Margaret Thornton, a widow who had taken Sara in when she had nowhere else to go and asked no questions about the past Sara clearly wanted to leave behind. Margaret was in the kitchen when Sara returned, rolling out biscuit dough with the efficiency of someone who had fed hungry men for 30 years. She looked up when Sara entered, flour dusting her broad cheeks, and smiled. "There you are, girl? Feeling better after your walk?" "Yes, madam." Sara tied an apron around her waist and began preparing vegetables for supper. The boarding house was full this week, mostly miners passing through on their way to claims further north and a few cowboys between jobs. The work was hard but honest, and Margaret paid fairly and never asked Sara to do anything that made her uncomfortable. "We've got a new boarder coming tomorrow," Margaret said, punching down a ball of dough with more force than necessary. Young cowboy looking for steady work at the Miller Ranch. Paid for a month in advance, which is more than most of these drifters manage. Sara felt her stomach do a strange flip. Did he give his name? Knox something Calloway, I think. You know him? We met briefly by the creek. Sara kept her eyes on the carrots she was chopping, willing her hands to stay steady. He seemed polite enough. Margaret made a thoughtful sound, but did not press further, which was one of the many reasons Sara was grateful to work for her. The older woman had an intuition about when to speak and when to let silence do its work. The next morning, Sara was setting the breakfast table when Knox arrived with his saddlebag slung over one shoulder and his hat in his hand. He looked tired from the road, but smiled when he saw Margaret, introducing himself with the same easy courtesy he had shown Sara by the creek. His gaze found Sara across the room, and something warm flickered in his eyes before he looked away, giving her the space to decide how to respond. She brought him coffee when he sat down to breakfast with the other boarders, pouring carefully and keeping her expression neutral. "Welcome to Fort McDowell, Mr. Calloway." "Thank you kindly, miss." He left the question hanging, gentle and undemanding. "Northwood. Sara Northwood. Miss Northwood." He nodded as if committing her name to memory, then turned his attention to his plate, letting her move on to serve the others without making her the center of attention. Over the following weeks, Sara found herself noticing Knox in ways that both frightened and intrigued her. He was up before dawn most mornings, heading out to the Miller Ranch, where he had indeed found work as a horse trainer. He came back in the evenings dusty and tired, but always with a kind word for Margaret and a soft smile for Sara that never felt like it wanted anything from her. He helped carry water without being asked, fixed a loose board on the porch because he noticed it wobbling, and once stopped a drunk miner from getting too friendly with one of the other women who worked at the boarding house, doing it with such calm authority that the situation diffused before it could become violent. Sara watched him carefully, waiting for the mask to slip, for the kindness to reveal itself as a trick or a trap. But Knox remained steady, patient, and genuinely good in a way that made her chest ache with something close to hope. One evening in late August, when the heat had finally broken and a cooling breeze swept through town, Sara was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when she heard Knox's voice from the other side of the sheet she had just pinned up. "Miss Northwood, could I speak with you for a moment?" She came around the clothesline to find him standing with his hat in his hands again, that gesture of respect that seemed to come naturally to him. The setting sun caught in his dark hair, turning it bronze, and his eyes were serious but kind. "What is it, Mr. Calloway?" "Knox, please. I'm not much for formality." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking younger and more uncertain. "I was wondering if you might let me walk you to church on Sunday. I know there's a service in the morning, and I thought maybe you'd like the company. But if that's too forward, I apologize. I'd like to get to know you better if you're willing." Sara's first instinct was to say no, to protect herself from the vulnerability of letting someone close. But something in Knox's earnest expression, the way he was asking rather than assuming, made her hesitate. She thought about the past 3 months, about how she had been so focused on surviving that she had forgotten about the possibility of actually living. "I usually help Margaret with breakfast preparations on Sunday mornings," she said slowly. "But I could meet you afterward, around 10 o'clock. The smile that spread across Knox's face was like sunrise, bright and full of warmth. 10 o'clock sounds perfect, thank you, Sara. I mean, Miss Northwood." "Sara is fine," she said, surprising herself. "Between us, I mean, Sara is fine." Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and the promise of another scorching day ahead. Sara dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Margaret had helped her sew from fabric bought with her first wages. She brushed her hair until it shone, pinning it up carefully to keep it off her neck, and tried not to think about the scars hidden beneath her collar. Knox was waiting outside the boarding house at precisely 10 o'clock, wearing clean trousers and a shirt that looked freshly pressed. He offered her his arm with a slight hesitation, as if unsure whether she would accept the gesture, and Sara found herself taking it after only a moment's pause. His arm was solid beneath her hand, strong and steady, and the simple contact sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach. The church was a modest wooden structure at the edge of town, painted white, and topped with a simple cross. Inside, the air was cooler, and sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows in shafts of golden light. Sara and Knox found seats near the back, and she was aware of curious glances from some of the other townspeople, speculation about the new cowboy and the quiet woman from the boarding house. The service was simple and earnest, led by a circuit preacher who came through Fort McDowell once a month. Sara found comfort in the familiar rhythms of hymns and prayer, and she was surprised to hear Knox's deep voice beside her, singing along with a natural ease that spoke of a childhood spent in church pews. Afterward, they walked together through the town, Knox keeping a respectful distance but staying close enough that Sara felt protected rather than crowded. They talked about small things at first, the weather and the town and the work they each did, feeling out the boundaries of this new connection between them. "Where are you from originally?" Sara asked as they passed the general store, its windows displaying goods imported from back east. "Colorado, mostly. My family had a small ranch up in the mountains, but we lost it after my father died. I've been working cattle drives and ranch work ever since, trying to save up enough to maybe start something of my own someday." Knox glanced at her sideways, his expression open and honest. "What about you? You don't sound like you're from Arizona." Sara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the instinct to deflect and hide. But something about Knox made her want to try, to be brave enough to let someone see even just a piece of her truth. "I'm from Missouri originally. My parents died when I was 16 and I came west looking for work. I ended up in some difficult situations, but I'm here now and that's what matters." Knox nodded slowly, and she could see him processing what she had not said, reading between the lines without pushing for details she was not ready to give. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "Fort McDowell is better for having you in it." They continued walking until they reached the edge of town, where the desert stretched out in all directions, vast and beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. Knox pointed out landmarks in the distance, the mountains to the east and the direction of the ranch where he worked, and Sara found herself relaxing into his presence, letting down her guard inch by careful inch. "Would you like to do this again?" Knox asked as they turned back toward the boarding house. "Maybe go riding next Sunday if Margaret can spare you. I'd like to show you some of the country around here. It's harsh, but there's a beauty to it if you know where to look." Sara hesitated, fear and hope warring in her chest. Riding meant being alone with him, away from the safety of town and witnesses, but it also meant time to talk, to continue building this fragile thing between them that felt both dangerous and necessary. "I'd like that," she said, making the decision before she could talk herself out of it. "But I'll need to ask Margaret first." "Of course. Let me know what she says." Margaret not only gave her permission, but seemed pleased by the development, insisting that Sara borrow her riding skirt and packing a lunch with enough food for two. "That Knox is a good man," she said as she wrapped biscuits and cold chicken in waxed paper. "I've seen enough cowboys to know the difference between the good ones and the bad ones. He's got a gentle soul, that boy. You could do a lot worse." Sara did not know how to respond to that, so she just thanked Margaret and tried not to let her nervousness show. The following Sunday, Knox arrived with 2 horses, his bay gelding and a sweet-tempered mare from the Miller Ranch. He helped Sara mount with careful hands, never touching her more than necessary, and they set off into the desert at an easy walk. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, all red rock and stubborn sage, with hawks circling overhead and the distant shape of mountains shimmering in the heat haze. Knox led them along a trail that followed a dry wash, pointing out signs of wildlife and telling stories about the horses he was training at the ranch. Sara listened more than she spoke, content to let his voice wash over her, finding peace in the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the vast sky overhead. They stopped for lunch in the shade of a rocky outcropping, dismounting and settling on a flat stone while the horses cropped at the sparse grass nearby. Knox unpacked the food Margaret had sent, dividing it equally and handing Sara her portion with a smile. "This is one of my favorite spots," he said, gesturing at the view spread out before them. "You can see for miles, but it feels private somehow, like the world can't touch you here." Sara understood what he meant. There was something about the isolation, the sheer scale of the land, that made her problems feel smaller, more manageable. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Harsh, but beautiful." They ate in comfortable silence, and then Knox said, "Sara, can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Her stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Those difficult situations you mentioned, the ones you ended up in after you came west, are you safe now? Is there anyone who might come looking for you, anyone you're afraid of?" Sara stared out at the desert, her throat tight. She had not talked about this with anyone, not even Margaret, who had guessed enough to never ask. But Knox's voice was so gentle, his concern so genuine, that she found the words coming despite her fear. "I took a job at a ranch about 50 miles from here, working as a housekeeper for a man named Henry Clayton. He seemed respectable at first, but after I'd been there a few weeks, things changed. He was cruel to everyone who worked for him, but especially to those of us who had nowhere else to go. He would punish us for things we had not done, mistakes we had not made. He had a whip, and he used it." Knox's hand clenched into a fist on his knee, but his voice stayed calm. "The scars on your back, they're from him." Sara jerked her head around to stare at him. "How did you know?" "I didn't, not for sure, but I've seen the way you move sometimes, careful, like as if your back pains you. And the way you flinch when someone comes up behind you too fast. I recognize the signs of someone who's been hurt." Knox's eyes were dark with anger, but it was not directed at her. "What happened to Clayton? Did you get away?" "A few of the ranch hands finally got word to the marshal about what was happening. There was a raid, and Clayton was arrested. I heard he's in prison now waiting for trial, but by then the damage was done. I came here to Fort McDowell because I didn't know where else to go, and Margaret gave me a chance when no one else would." Knox was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, Sara. You didn't deserve any of it. No one does." "I know that in my head," Sara said, blinking back tears, "but sometimes my heart doesn't believe it. Sometimes I still feel like I must have done something to deserve it, like there's something wrong with me that made him choose me." "There's nothing wrong with you." Knox turned to face her fully, his eyes intense. What he did was evil, plain and simple. You survived something terrible, and you're still here, still fighting. That takes more courage than most people have. Sara felt something crack open inside her chest, a dam breaking that released tears she had been holding back for months. Knox reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he gently squeezed her hand. The simple contact was overwhelming. Kindness without demand, comfort without expectation. They sat like that until Sara's tears subsided, Knox's hand steady and warm around hers, the desert stretching out endless and indifferent around them. When she finally looked up, embarrassed by her breakdown, Knox just smiled and handed her his handkerchief. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said. "I know it wasn't easy to tell." "It wasn't," Sara admitted, wiping her eyes. "But I'm glad I did. I'm tired of carrying it alone." They rode back to town slowly, letting the horses take their time. And when Knox helped Sara dismount in front of the boarding house, his hands lingered just a moment longer than necessary on her waist. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "Not just at meals, I mean. I'd like to keep spending time with you if you're willing." Sara looked up at him, at this good man who had listened without judgment and offered comfort without conditions, and felt something in her chest that might have been the beginning of hope. "I'd like that too." Over the following weeks, Sara and Knox fell into a pattern of spending time together whenever their work allowed. They took walks in the evening when the heat had faded, sat together on the porch of the boarding house talking until the stars came out, and shared meals at the long table with the other boarders while finding ways to catch each other's eye and smile. Knox was patient and gentle, never pushing Sara beyond what she was ready for, but making it clear through 100 small gestures that he cared for her deeply. The other boarders noticed, of course, and so did the people of Fort McDowell. There were some whispers, speculation about Sara's past, and whether a good man like Knox should be associating with someone who came from questionable circumstances. But Knox shut down any gossip he heard with a quiet firmness that left no room for argument, and Sara found herself caring less about what others thought as she began to see herself through Knox's eyes, as someone worthy of respect and affection. One evening in late September, when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken and the desert nights were cool enough to need a shawl, Knox asked Sara if she would take a walk with him. They strolled through the quiet streets of Fort McDowell, past the darkened storefronts and the saloon where piano music drifted out into the night, until they reached the creek where they had first met. The water reflected the moonlight, silver and black, and Knox guided Sara to a smooth rock where they could sit side by side. For a while they just listened to the sound of the water flowing, the night insects singing, and the distant howl of a coyote. "Sara," Knox said finally, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something and I want you to hear me out before you respond." Her heart began to race, but she nodded. "I'm falling in love with you," Knox said, the words simple and direct. "I think I started falling that first day by the creek, and every moment I've spent with you since has just made it stronger. I know you've been hurt, and I know you have good reason to be cautious. I'm not asking you to say anything back right now. I just need you to know how I feel and that I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as it takes for you to heal, to trust me, to maybe feel the same way." Sara felt tears prickling her eyes again, but this time they were not born from pain. "Knox, I don't know if I'm capable of loving someone properly. I feel like I'm broken, like Henry Clayton took something from me that I can't get back." "You're not broken," Knox said firmly. He reached out and took both her hands in his, holding them gently. "You're hurt, and that's different. Hurt can heal, given time and care. And Sara, you are so much stronger than you think you are. I see it every day, the way you keep going, the way you're rebuilding your life. That's not broken. That's brave." "I'm scared," Sara whispered. "I'm scared of letting you close and having you realize that I'm not worth the trouble. I'm scared of being vulnerable again and getting hurt. I'm scared of so many things." "Fear makes sense after what you've been through, but Sara, look at me." Knox waited until her eyes met his. "I'm not him. I will never hurt you the way he did, and you are worth every bit of trouble, and then some. You're kind and resilient and beautiful, and I count every moment I get to spend with you as a gift." Sara felt something shift inside her, the walls she had built so carefully beginning to crack and crumble. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said, the words coming out shaky but honest. "It terrifies me, but I think I am." Knox's face transformed with joy, and he lifted one of her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with such tenderness that Sara felt her breath catch. "We'll go slow," he promised, "as slow as you need. There's no rush, no pressure. We'll build this together at whatever pace feels right to you." They sat by the creek until the moon was high overhead, talking about their hopes and fears, their pasts, and possible futures. Knox told Sara about his dream of having his own ranch someday, a place where he could raise horses and build something lasting. Sara admitted that she had never let herself dream beyond surviving, but that maybe now she could start to imagine what a future might look like. When Knox finally walked Sara back to the boarding house, he paused at the door, his hand still holding hers. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Only if you want me to, no pressure." Sara's heart hammered in her chest, fear and desire tangling together. But when she looked at Knox's face, open and honest and full of affection, she found herself nodding. Knox leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so soft and sweet that Sara felt her eyes sting with tears. It lasted only a moment, gentle and chaste, and when Knox pulled back, he was smiling. "Good night, Sara. Sleep well." "Good night, Knox." Sara floated up to her small room in the attic of the boarding house, her lips still tingling from the kiss, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. She undressed carefully in the dark, hanging her dress on the hook by the door and pulling her nightgown over her head. As the fabric settled over her shoulders, she felt the familiar pull of scar tissue on her back, the reminder of pain and cruelty that she carried with her always. For the first time, instead of feeling shame, Sara felt a flicker of something else. Anger, perhaps, or defiance. These scars were part of her story, but they did not define her. Knox had seen past them to the person she was inside, and maybe it was time for Sara to do the same. The next few months passed in a blur of quiet joy and growing trust. Knox continued to court Sara with patience and care, and Sara found herself slowly opening up, letting him see more of who she really was beneath the protective layers she had built. They talked about everything and nothing, shared meals and walks and stolen moments of laughter that made the harsh Arizona landscape feel like home. In November, Knox took Sara to meet the Miller family, the ranchers who employed him. They were good people, a husband and wife with 3 grown children, and they welcomed Sara warmly, clearly fond of Knox and happy to see him with someone who made him smile. Over dinner, Thomas Miller mentioned that he was looking to expand his horse breeding operation and wanted Knox to take on more responsibility. "You've got a real gift with the animals," Thomas said, passing a bowl of potatoes across the table. "I'd like to offer you a partnership if you're interested. You'd have a share in the profits and a permanent place here. Maybe even build yourself a proper house on the property, settle down properly." Knox glanced at Sara, his expression hopeful but uncertain, as if trying to gauge her reaction. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Miller. Can I have some time to think about it?" "Of course, son. No rush, but I'd be pleased to have you as a partner." On the ride back to Fort McDowell, Sara asked, "Why didn't you say yes right away? It sounds like a wonderful opportunity." Knox was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse carefully in the darkness. "Because a partnership like that, a permanent position, that's the kind of thing you do when you're ready to put down roots, and I didn't want to make that decision without talking to you first. Sara, I'm not trying to pressure you, but I need you to know that when I think about my future, you're in it. So if I'm going to make big decisions, I want to make them with you, not just for me." Sara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Knox, I don't want to hold you back from good opportunities." "You're not holding me back. You're the reason I want to stay, the reason I want to build something lasting, but only if that's what you want too. If you need more time, or if you're not sure about us, I need to know that before I commit to staying here permanently." They stopped their horses in the middle of the trail, the night sky brilliant with stars overhead. Sara looked at Knox, at this man who had shown her what real kindness looked like, who had been patient with her fears and gentle with her heart, and realized that she did not want to live in fear anymore. She wanted to choose hope, to choose him. "I want you to take the partnership," she said firmly. "I want you to build that house and put down roots. And Knox, I want to be part of that future you're building if you'll have me." Knox dismounted in one smooth motion and came to stand beside Sara's horse, looking up at her with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. "Sara Northwood, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying yes to all of it, to you, to us, to whatever future we can build together. I'm done letting fear make my decisions. I love you, Knox Calloway, and I want to spend my life with you." Knox reached up and lifted Sara down from her horse, holding her close with his arms wrapped around her waist. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible. And Sara, I promise you, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on me." He kissed her then, longer and deeper than before, and Sara felt the last of her walls crumble away, leaving her open and vulnerable but safe in the knowledge that Knox would never use that vulnerability to hurt her. They were married in January of 1877 in the same small church where they had attended that first service together. Margaret stood up with Sara, having become something like a mother to her, and Thomas Miller stood with Knox. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when Knox slipped a plain gold band onto Sara's finger, she felt like she was being reborn into a life she had never dared to imagine. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with Margaret cooking a feast and half the town turning out to wish them well. Sara wore a new dress that she and Margaret had sewn together, pale yellow cotton that made her feel pretty and special, and Knox looked handsome in a new suit coat that he had purchased from the general store. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Knox pulled Sara aside, his expression suddenly nervous. "Are you ready to go home? I mean, to our home?" Sara's stomach fluttered with nervousness and anticipation. Knox had been building their house for the past 2 months, working on it every spare moment with help from the Miller sons and some of the other ranch hands. He had not let Sara see it yet, wanting it to be a surprise, and she was both eager and terrified to see this place, where they would begin their married life together. They rode out to the Miller ranch in Knox's wagon, their few possessions packed in boxes in the back. The house was about a mile from the main ranch buildings, situated on a slight rise with a view of the mountains in the distance. Even in the darkness, Sara could see that it was beautiful, a solid wooden structure with a wide porch and real glass windows that must have cost Knox dearly. Knox helped Sara down from the wagon and then, before she could protest, swept her up into his arms. "Got to carry you over the threshold," he said with a grin. "It's tradition." He pushed open the door and carried her inside, setting her down gently in the middle of what was clearly going to be their main living area. Knox lit a lamp, and warm light flooded the space, revealing walls of smooth wood and a stone fireplace and furniture that was simple but well made. "Knox, it's wonderful," Sara breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "You built this?" "With a lot of help," Knox said, looking pleased by her reaction. "There's a kitchen through that door and a bedroom in the back. I wanted to make sure you had a real home, Sara. A place that's ours, where you always feel safe." Sara walked through the house slowly, running her hands over the surfaces Knox had sanded smooth, examining the careful joinery and the small touches that showed how much thought he had put into every detail. The kitchen had a good stove and shelves for dishes, and the bedroom had a large bed covered with a quilt that Margaret must have contributed. When she turned back to Knox, he was watching her with an expression of hope and vulnerability that made her heart ache. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Knox, it's absolutely perfect." Relief flooded Knox's face, and he crossed the room to take her in his arms. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other. And then Knox said quietly, "Sara, I know this is our wedding night, and there are expectations, but I want you to know there's no pressure. We can take things as slow as you need. I'm in no rush." Sara pulled back to look at him, at this man who had been nothing but patient and understanding, and felt a surge of love so strong it was almost overwhelming. "I want to be a real wife to you, Knox, but I'm nervous. That is, Clayton never. But I've seen enough to know what's supposed to happen, and I'm afraid." Knox's expression darkened at the mention of Clayton, but he kept his voice gentle. "We don't have to do anything tonight except sleep, if that's what you need. And when you are ready, I promise I'll be gentle. Sara, I would rather spend the rest of my life sleeping beside you fully clothed than do anything that makes you uncomfortable or afraid." Tears pricked Sara's eyes at his words, at the absolute sincerity in his voice. "I trust you," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. She did trust Knox with her heart and her body and her future. "I want to try, but Knox, there's something you should know first, something you haven't actually seen." She turned away from him, her hands trembling as she reached for the buttons on the back of her dress. Knox started to protest, to tell her she did not have to show him anything, but Sara shook her head. "I need you to see, to really see, before we go any further. I need to know that you can look at me, at all of me, and not be repulsed." Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, and after a moment Knox stepped forward. "May I help?" Sara nodded, not trusting her voice, and Knox's fingers were warm and steady as he worked the buttons free one by one. When the dress was open, Sara let it slip down her arms, leaving her standing in just her chemise. She took a deep breath and then pulled that over her head as well, bearing her back to Knox's gaze for the first time. She heard his sharp intake of breath and felt her whole body tense, waiting for disgust or pity or any of the reactions she had imagined in her worst moments. But when Knox spoke, his voice was thick with sorrow and anger. "Oh, Sara, what he did to you." She felt his fingertips brush against her shoulder blade, feather light and questioning, and she forced herself not to flinch away. Knox traced one of the scars, a long raised line that ran from her right shoulder down to her lower back, and his touch was so gentle that Sara felt tears spill down her cheeks. "May I?" Knox asked, his voice rough, and when Sara nodded, he traced another scar and then another, mapping the evidence of her pain with reverent fingers. "You are so strong," he murmured, "so incredibly strong to have survived this, to have become the woman you are despite what he did to you." Sara turned to face him, not bothering to hide her tears. "You're not disgusted?" "Disgusted?" Knox looked shocked. "Sara, no, never. I'm furious at the man who hurt you and heartbroken that you went through something so terrible, but disgusted by you. How could I be? These scars are part of your story, part of what makes you who you are. They don't make you less beautiful or less worthy of love. If anything, they make me love you more, because I know how much courage it took to show them to me." He pulled her close, holding her against his chest, and Sara could feel his heart beating fast beneath her cheek. They stood like that for a long time, Sara half undressed and Knox fully clothed, just holding each other while Sara cried out years of shame and fear. When she finally pulled back, Knox cupped her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her tear-stained cheeks. "We don't have to do anything more tonight," he said. "Let's just sleep, you and me. Everything else can wait." But Sara shook her head. "I don't want to wait anymore. I want to be your wife in every way. I want to reclaim my body from what he did to it. Knox, please. Be gentle with me, but don't make me wait." Knox searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear, and then nodded slowly. "All right. But Sara, if at any point you want to stop, you just say so. No questions, no hurt feelings. This is about us, about love, not about obligation or expectations." What happened next was tender and slow, Knox undressing with careful movements while Sara watched from the bed wrapped in the quilt. When he joined her, he kept his promise, gentle and patient and attentive to every shift in her breathing, every tension in her body. There was some pain, because Sara was inexperienced and nervous, but there was also sweetness and connection, and the overwhelming sense of being cherished. Afterward, Knox held Sara close, his hand running up and down her scarred back in long, soothing strokes, and she realized that she was not afraid anymore. The scars were still there, and they probably always would be, but they were no longer chains binding her to the past. They were just part of her story, and Knox loved her anyway, scars and all. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Knox murmured back, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always and forever, Sara Calloway." Their life together settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and miraculous. Knox worked with the horses at the Miller Ranch, building the breeding program into something truly special, while Sara took on work helping Margaret at the boarding house a few days a week and starting to build a small garden at their house. The desert was not easy land to coax life from, but Sara found satisfaction in the challenge, in making things grow where nothing had grown before. They made friends in Fort McDowell, joining the small community of settlers and ranchers who were building lives in the harsh Arizona territory. There were dances on Saturday nights and church on Sunday mornings and gatherings for barn raisings and harvest celebrations. Sara found herself part of a community in a way she had never been before, not just tolerated, but welcomed, valued for her kindness and her strength. In the spring of 1878, Sara realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror, Excitement about bringing a child into the world with Knox tempered by fear about whether she would be a good mother, whether her past would somehow taint the innocent life growing inside her. Knox was thrilled when she told him, picking her up and spinning her around despite her laughing protest to be careful. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Sara, we're going to be parents." The pregnancy was not easy. The Arizona heat was brutal that summer, and Sara struggled with nausea and exhaustion. But Knox was attentive and caring, bringing her cool water and fanning her when she felt overheated, rubbing her feet when they swelled, and reading aloud to her in the evenings from the newspapers that came up from Phoenix. Their son was born in December, after a long and difficult labor that left Sara exhausted but triumphant. Knox had stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. And when the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Knox had tears streaming down his face. "He's beautiful," Knox said, cradling the tiny bundle with surprising confidence. "Sara, he's absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Knox's father, and he became the center of their world. Sara discovered that she loved being a mother, that the patience and strength she had developed surviving her trauma served her well in caring for this tiny, demanding human who needed her completely. Knox was a wonderful father, patient and playful, and watching him with their son made Sara's heart feel so full it might burst. As James grew from infant to toddler, Sara and Knox's life together deepened and strengthened. They had hard times, of course, droughts that made water scarce and winters that were colder than expected, and the occasional conflict that any married couple faces. But they had built their relationship on a foundation of honesty and respect, and they worked through problems together rather than letting them fester. Sara's scars became just another part of their life together. Knox still traced them sometimes when they lay together in the darkness, and Sara no longer flinched at his touch. She had learned to see her body through his eyes, not as something damaged or shameful, but as evidence of her survival, her strength. When James was 3, Sara became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1882, a tiny girl with Knox's dark hair and Sara's determination. They named her Grace, because that was what she felt like to Sara, an unearned gift, a blessing she had never dared to hope for. Life continued to unfold in the way that good lives do, full of ordinary joys and small challenges. Knox's partnership with Thomas Miller prospered, and they were able to expand their house, adding a proper parlor and bedrooms for the children. Sara's garden grew year by year, and she became known in Fort McDowell for her vegetables and herbs, which she sold at the market and traded with neighbors. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses as much as his father did. And Grace was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity who kept them all on their toes. Sara and Knox watched their children grow with pride and wonder, grateful every day for the family they had built together. There were moments, of course, when the past tried to intrude. Sara would see a man who reminded her of Clayton, or have a nightmare that left her shaking and afraid, but Knox was always there to ground her, to remind her that she was safe, that the past was behind her and could not hurt her anymore. In 1885, word came that Henry Clayton had died in prison, succumbing to illness before he could ever stand trial. When Sara heard the news, she expected to feel relief or vindication, but instead she felt mostly nothing. Clayton was not important anymore, not relevant to the life she had built. He was just a bad man who had done terrible things, and his death changed nothing about who Sara was or the future she was creating with Knox and their children. The years passed, marked by the slow accumulation of memories and milestones. James learned to ride at 5 and was helping Knox with the horses by the time he was 8. Grace started school and proved to be bright and determined, insisting that she wanted to learn everything there was to know about the world. Sara and Knox celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, weathered illnesses and injuries and the occasional financial setback, and through it all, their love for each other only grew stronger. When James was 12 and Grace was 9, Thomas Miller died peacefully in his sleep, and his widow decided to sell the ranch. Knox was given the first option to buy, and after long discussions with Sara, they decided to take the risk. It meant going into debt and taking on enormous responsibility, but it also meant that everything Knox had been building would truly be theirs. The Miller Ranch became the Calloway Ranch, and Knox threw himself into the work with passion and dedication. Sara became his partner in every sense, managing the books and helping to make decisions about breeding lines and business strategies. Together they built something that was successful and sustainable, a legacy for their children. Fort McDowell grew and changed around them. The territory became more settled, with the railroad reaching nearby towns and bringing goods and people from back east. Some of the old rough edges of frontier life smoothed out, though the land itself remained harsh and beautiful and demanding. Sara watched her children grow into young adults with pride and a touch of wistfulness. James became a talented horseman like his father, respected throughout the territory for his skill with difficult animals. Grace was determined to go back east for schooling to become a teacher, and though Sara worried about her daughter leaving, she was proud of Grace's ambition and independence. One evening in the summer of 1892, Sara and Knox sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the desert they had made their own. James was out checking on a mare who was due to foal, and Grace was inside reading by lamplight, and for a moment everything was peaceful and perfect. "Can you believe it's been 15 years?" Sara said, leaning her head on Knox's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we got married, and sometimes it feels like we've been together forever." Knox wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Best 15 years of my life. Sara, I know I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful every single day that you took a chance on me, that you trusted me enough to build this life together." Sara turned to look at him, at the man who had traced her scars with gentle fingers and taught her that love did not have to hurt, that safety and trust were possible even after terrible betrayal. His hair was touched with gray now, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But he was still the same Knox who had offered her his arm that first Sunday morning, still patient and kind and deeply good. "I'm the one who should be grateful," Sara said. "You saved my life, Knox. Not just that first day by the creek, but every day since. You showed me that I was worth saving, worth loving. You gave me a family and a home and a future I never thought I could have." Knox kissed her temple, his lips warm against her skin. "We saved each other," he said. "That's what love does, Sara. It makes us stronger together than we ever could be apart." They sat like that as the stars came out, as the desert cooled from the heat of the day, as their life together stretched out around them in all directions. Sara thought about the girl she had been, broken and scared and convinced she would never be whole again. She thought about the scars on her back, still there after all these years, but no longer symbols of shame or pain. Now they were just part of her story, the story of a woman who had survived and thrived and built something beautiful from the ashes of her trauma. James returned from the barn with news that the mare had successfully foaled, a strong colt that would make a fine addition to their breeding program. Grace emerged from the house to share something funny from her book. The family gathered on the porch, talking and laughing as the night deepened around them, and Sara felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was the life she had fought for, the life she had chosen when she chose Knox all those years ago. It was not perfect because nothing in life ever was, but it was good and real and hers. The scars on her back had not disappeared, and she still carried the memories of what had been done to her, but those things no longer defined her. She was Sara Calloway, wife and mother and rancher, beloved and strong and free. As the years continued to unfold, as James married and started his own family, as Grace returned from school and opened a small schoolhouse in Fort McDowell, as Sara and Knox grew older together, the foundation they had built together only grew stronger. They faced losses and challenges, celebrated triumphs and milestones, and through it all, their love remained constant. Knox never stopped tracing Sara's scars with gentle fingers, and Sara never stopped marveling at the tenderness in his touch. They were a reminder of how far they had come, of the healing that was possible when two people chose to love each other with patience and grace. In the end, that was the story Sara would tell her grandchildren when they asked about how she and their grandfather had met. Not about the pain or the cruelty that had marked her past, but about the kindness of a cowboy who had seen past her scars to the person she was inside. About how love had healed what violence had broken. About how choosing hope over fear had given her a life beyond anything she had dared to dream. And late at night, when Knox held her close in the darkness of their bedroom, his fingers tracing the familiar landscape of her back, Sara would close her eyes and give thanks for the man who had taught her that she was worthy of love, scars and all. The cowboy who had traced each line with gentle fingers and shown her that her past did not have to determine her future, that healing was possible, that love could transform even the deepest wounds into strength. Their story was one of survival and redemption, of two people who had found each other in a harsh land and built something beautiful together. It was a story of scars that became symbols not of shame, but of courage, of pain that transformed into purpose, of a love that proved stronger than any trauma. As Sara grew old beside Knox, watching their children and grandchildren fill the ranch house with noise and laughter, she knew that this was the happily ever after she had never dared to imagine. Not because life was perfect or easy, but because she had found someone who loved her completely, who had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to stay, who had traced her scars with gentle fingers and called her beautiful. The desert sun continued to rise and set over the Calloway Ranch, marking the passage of days and seasons and years. Sara and Knox worked side by side, building their legacy, raising their family, and loving each other with a depth and constancy that became legendary in Fort McDowell. People spoke of them with admiration, of the quiet cowboy and his strong wife who had built something lasting in an unforgiving land. When Knox's health began to fail in his 70s, Sara nursed him with the same tender care he had always shown her. She held his hand through the bad days and celebrated the good ones, grateful for every moment they had together. And when he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, Sara mourned him deeply, but did not regret a single day of their life together. She lived another 5 years after Knox's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a family that bore testament to the power of love to heal and transform. And when Sara's time finally came, she died peacefully in the house Knox had built for her, in the bed they had shared for so many years. Her children found her there in the morning, a peaceful smile on her face. And when they prepared her body for burial, they were not ashamed of the scars on her back. Instead, they saw them as their mother had learned to see them, as evidence of her strength and survival, as the beginning of a love story that had changed all their lives. Sara Northwood Calloway was buried beside her husband on a rise overlooking the ranch they had built together, and her tombstone bore a simple inscription: "Beloved wife, mother, and friend. She survived, she healed, she loved." And in the hearts of everyone who had known her, Sara lived on as a testament to the power of choosing hope, of accepting love, and of healing from even the deepest wounds. The Calloway Ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family Sara and Knox had created, and the story of how it all began was told and retold, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes and the darkest circumstances, love could take root and flourish. That a cowboy with gentle hands and a scarred woman with a brave heart could build something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. And so the story ended where it began, with scars that told a tale of pain transformed into strength, with a love that proved stronger than trauma, with a life built on the foundation of two people who chose each other and never looked back. Sara's back had been scarred from whips she did not earn, but the cowboy had traced each one with gentle fingers, and in doing so had helped her write a new story, one of healing and hope, and a love that lasted forever.